Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are very interested in knowing the places and the times of day or night that these documented accounts reach. In the shadow of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where Potomac and Shenandoah rivers meet, lies a town with turbulent past that extends far beyond John Brown's famous raid. This is Harpers Ferry, West Virginia, in the year 1896, a time when the whistle of steam engines echoed through the valley, and the Civil War remained a fresh wound in local memory. It was here, in a white clapboard house overlooking the confluence of the rivers, that the Blackwood Sisters ran what many locals called the finest boarding house in the county. Their reputation for hospitality was strong, but it was shadowed by a series of mysterious disappearances that plagued the establishment. Disappearances that would not be fully connected until decades later. County records show that between 1892 and 1896, at least 7 travelers who stayed at the Blackwood house were never seen again. Their belongings, however, sometimes resurfaced. A pocket watch here, a pair of spectacles there, and always, those items were found in the possession of one of the 3 sisters who ran the boarding house. When questioned, the sisters claimed that their guests had left early, often before dawn, leaving personal effects behind as payment for unpaid debts. The local sheriff, Thomas Harlow, who was related to the sisters by marriage, never pursued the matter further. The story of the Blackwood Sisters remained buried in courthouse archives until 1953, when Professor James Whitaker at Georgetown University uncovered a series of ledgers during his research for a book on post-Civil War commerce in the Shenandoah Valley. What he discovered set him on a path that ended with his own mysterious disappearance. And by 1968, the government had sealed the case completely. What follows is the account pieced together from surviving documents, old newspaper clippings, and interviews with descendants of those who lived in Harpers Ferry during those 4 fateful years. These records tell a tale of isolation, desperation, and the darkest sides of human nature. A story where hospitality concealed calculated malice, and where a warm meal was often the prelude to something far more sinister. The Blackwood family had deep roots in Jefferson County, dating back to the early 1800s. Land deed records from 1823 show that Jeremiah Blackwood, a merchant from Baltimore, purchased 20 acres of land overlooking the rivers, including the plot where the house would later stand. The deed describes the property as a superior parcel, with commanding views of the river junction and easy access to the main thoroughfare. Jeremiah's business ledgers, partially preserved in the Jefferson County Historical Society collection, show that he established a successful dry goods business on Shenandoah Street, importing fine fabrics and household items from eastern cities. Local church records from St. Peter's Catholic Church show that the Blackwoods were prominent members of the congregation. They contributed heavily to the construction of a new church building in 1833. Jeremiah's wife, Catherine, appears frequently in the records of the Ladies' Auxiliary, organizing charity drives for the poor and hosting social gatherings for prominent families. By 1840, tax assessment records show that the Blackwoods owned not only their original property and store, but also a small farm outside town and several rental properties along High Street. A business directory published in Baltimore in 1842 listed Jeremiah Blackwood as one of the foremost merchants of the growing river community. His establishment was said to provide superior goods to the distinguished families of Jefferson County. Their son, William, born in 1821, was sent east for his education, first to a preparatory academy in Philadelphia and later to Harvard College, where alumni records confirm he graduated in 1842. William returned to Harpers Ferry and gradually took over management of the family businesses as his father grew older. When Jeremiah died in 1852, William inherited the entire family fortune, which by that time was one of the largest private estates in Jefferson County. In 1853, William married Elizabeth Hollister, uniting 2 prominent local families. Their wedding, according to a notice in the Virginia Free Press, was attended by the most distinguished personages of the region, including representatives of the Washburn, Storr, and Lockwood families. Elizabeth was described as a woman of refined education and personal fortune. She had studied at the exclusive Troy Female Seminary in New York. The couple established their home in the family residence overlooking the rivers, which William had renovated extensively after his father's death. Building permits filed with the county show major expansions, including a third floor, a larger kitchen, and even modern plumbing, luxuries far ahead of the time. By all accounts, the Blackwoods lived as members of the regional gentry. They hosted dinners, attended church, and participated in the social traditions of wealthy families. Their first daughter, Margaret, was born in 1854, followed by Eleanor in 1858 and Ruth in 1863. Baptismal records from St. Peter's confirm that each child was christened with considerable ceremony, with godparents chosen from among the county's most prominent families. School records also show that the girls were educated by private tutors brought in from Baltimore and Philadelphia, another mark of the family's wealth and influence. But the Civil War changed everything for the Blackwoods, as it did for so many families in the border states. William Blackwood, who had inherited the family properties from his father in 1852, made a fateful decision in April 1861. When Virginia voted to secede from the Union, Jefferson County, which would later become part of West Virginia, was deeply divided. William, who had been educated in northern schools and who maintained strong business interests in Baltimore and Philadelphia, chose to support the Union. Military records show that William Blackwood received a commission as a lieutenant colonel in the 2nd West Virginia Volunteer Infantry in July 1861. His service record was distinguished. He fought in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns under General Sheridan and was wounded at the Battle of Cedar Creek in October 1864. Letters from William to his wife Elizabeth, preserved in a private collection donated to the West Virginia State Archives in 1947, reveal his inner conflict. He wrote, "I cannot in good conscience support the dissolution of our great republic. Though I know my position places you and our dear children in a difficult place among our neighbors, I pray that when this conflict ends, reconciliation will be possible." These letters also show how much the Blackwood businesses suffered during William's absence. In June 1863, he wrote, "Your report of the store's declining trade pains me, though I understand that many who once count themselves our friends now take their custom elsewhere. We must endure this trial as we have others, with dignity and patience." By 1864, the situation had worsened. A September letter noted, "I am distressed to hear that the rental properties now stand empty and that you've been forced to dismiss the household staff. Please assure Martha and Joseph that they will be welcome back when circumstances improve." During the Civil War, Harpers Ferry changed hands many times, occupied by both Union and Confederate forces. The Blackwood home, due to its prominent location overlooking the rivers, was often requisitioned as officers' quarters. A damage claim filed with the federal government in 1866 describes the property's condition after the war: destruction of furniture, defaced walls, broken windows, and the theft of household items by troops from both armies. But William's homecoming was not the triumphant return he might have imagined. Local sentiment in Jefferson County had leaned strongly toward the Confederacy. Those who supported the Union were often treated as traitors. The Blackwood family, once highly respected, now found themselves social outcasts in the very community they had helped build. Reverend Samuel Woodson, pastor of the Presbyterian Church the Blackwoods, had attended for generations, wrote in his personal journal in September 1865, "Colonel Blackwood attended services today for the first time since his return. Several families rose and departed when he entered. His wife appeared distressed, but the colonel himself maintained his dignity. The 3 daughters sat very still, like little statues. One wonders what effect this treatment will have on such young minds. The ostracism continued for years. Business ledgers from that period show that local merchants often charged the Blackwoods higher prices, or refused to extend credit that was routinely given to other families of similar standing. Invitations to social events no longer arrived. The once prominent family retreated into growing isolation. A diary kept by Harriet Stanton, a neighbor whose family remained on friendly terms with the Blackwoods, offers insight into this decline. She wrote, "Took tea with Elizabeth yesterday. The house, once so full of life and visitors, now stands silent. The girls are growing up without proper society or friends their own age. Elizabeth confided that they have received no invitations to any of the summer gatherings. The Colonel spends his days in his study with his books and his bourbon. One feels the weight of their isolation upon crossing the threshold. Elizabeth Blackwood, the Colonel's wife, appears to have suffered most from this isolation. Dr. Theodore Lambert's medical journal, dated 1872, contains multiple entries about her condition. Mrs. B continues to exhibit symptoms of nervous exhaustion and melancholia. She speaks of hearing whispers when in town and believes former friends are conspiring against the family. The Colonel reports she is taken to spending entire days in her bedroom with the curtains drawn. Over the next years, Lambert's journal provides a disturbing record of her mental decline. April 1873. Mrs. B now refuses to leave the house entirely. She has developed peculiar habits. She insists on checking the locks multiple times each night. She believes neighbors are watching the house from the woods beyond the garden. She has lost considerable weight due to poor appetite. November 1874. Mrs. B's condition continues to worsen. She now shows paranoid delusions regarding the household food. She believes unnamed enemies are attempting to poison the family. She insists on preparing all meals herself, despite this once being the work of household staff. The Colonel reports that she will not allow the daughters to eat anything she has not personally prepared and tasted first. February 1875. Most troubling development in Mrs. B's case. She now experiences auditory hallucinations. Voices instruct her to protect her daughters from unnamed threats. She has taken to sleeping outside their bedroom door. Personal hygiene severely neglected. I have suggested institutional care, but the Colonel refuses to consider it present. By 1876, Elizabeth's condition had deteriorated beyond what could be managed at home. Records from Western State Hospital in Staunton, Virginia, confirm her admission on June 12, 1876, with a diagnosis of severe melancholia with paranoid features. The admitting physician wrote, "Patient believes her food is being poisoned by neighbors, shows extreme agitation when served meals, has lost considerable weight due to refusal to eat." The hospital's quarterly reports to Colonel Blackwood, copies of which were preserved in Dr. Lambert's files, show little improvement over time. September 1876. Patient remains withdrawn and suspicious, accepts only minimal nourishment, and must be closely monitored to ensure adequate intake. Refuses to participate in occupational therapy or social activities. December 1876. 1877. Patient has developed ritualistic behaviors around food consumption. She will only eat after elaborate preparation and careful inspection of every item. She has accused hospital staff of working in collusion with unnamed enemies. Sedation is sometimes required during episodes of extreme agitation. March 1879. No significant improvement. Patient now speaks rarely, even to attending physicians. She continues to express the belief that she was committed only to prevent her from protecting her daughters from harm. Requests to see her children have become less frequent. Elizabeth remained institutionalized until her death in 1883. Hospital records describe her as withdrawn and uncommunicative throughout her stay, though nurses noted that she brightened somewhat during the rare visits from her daughters. The Colonel, however, visited only twice in 7 years. He claimed that the demands of managing the family properties prevented him from traveling more often. Her death certificate lists the cause as general failure of health systems consequent to self-starvation, suggesting that Elizabeth's paranoia about food ultimately contributed to her death. She was buried in the Blackwood family plot in Harpers Ferry. though funeral records note that the service was sparsely attended. Another clear sign of the family's growing social isolation. The three daughters, Margaret, Eleanor, and Ruth, were left largely to their own devices during these difficult years. School records from Jefferson Academy show that all three were exceptional students. Margaret was especially gifted in mathematics and accounting. Her term papers, preserved in the Academy's archives, reveal an unusual focus on financial management and investment strategies, subjects rarely pursued by young women of that time. Eleanor showed remarkable talent in domestic arts. Her prize-winning embroidery, displayed at the Jefferson County Fair in 1872, was described by the local newspaper as showing exceptional precision and attention to detail, with stitches so fine as to be nearly invisible to the naked eye. Her teachers often noted her perfectionist tendencies. One evaluation read, "Miss Eleanor will unpick and restart her work multiple times until achieving the exact result she desires. She shows unusual patience for one so young." Ruth, the youngest, displayed a striking aptitude for chemistry. Several of her teachers noted her unusual curiosity. An essay written by Ruth at age 13, preserved in the Academy's archives, reveals her deep interest in the preparation and preservation of food, particularly meats. The essay, titled "On Modern Methods of Food Preservation and Their Chemical Foundations," demonstrates knowledge far beyond what would be expected of a student her age. Her science instructor added a troubling note: "Unusually detailed understanding of organic decomposition for a student of this age shows a somewhat concerning focus on methods of preserving animal tissue." All three girls withdrew from formal schooling following their mother's hospitalization. Margaret at age 18, Eleanor at 14, and Ruth at only 9. The colonel apparently decided that home education was more appropriate, given the family's isolation. He hired a series of private tutors, though town records suggest none stayed for more than a few months. One such tutor, Miss Caroline Spencer, wrote to a friend in Baltimore in 1879. "The Blackwood girls are intelligent beyond their years, but there is something disquieting about the household. The youngest especially asks questions that no child should contemplate. The colonel is often absent, and the house maintains a silence that presses upon one's spirit. I shall not renew my contract when the term ends." Another tutor, James Harrison, lasted only 6 weeks before departing without collecting his final wages. In a letter to the headmaster of his former school, he explained, "The situation at the Blackwood house is not as represented. The girls, though intellectually capable, display disturbing tendencies. The eldest manages the household accounts with suspicious precision for one her age. The middle child spends hours arranging and rearranging items in the house to achieve some standard of order only she can discern. And the youngest, I cannot adequately describe my discomfort with her preoccupations. She dissects small animals found on the property, claiming scientific interest, but the enthusiasm she displays is most unseemly. The colonel, when present, is either indifferent or inebriated. I could not, in good conscience, continue." For the next 15 years, the Blackwood sisters lived in deepening isolation. Neighbors reported seeing them only at church or during rare trips to town for supplies. Their once broad social circle had contracted to only a handful of loyal friends and distant relatives who visited occasionally from out of town. By the late 1880s, Colonel Blackwood's health began to fail. Dr. Lambert's journal records frequent treatments for respiratory complaints and for episodes of confusion and agitation, particularly at night. His notes from 1890 express concern about the colonel's mental state. Patient expresses belief that former Confederate soldiers are plotting to burn his house. Has taken to keeping loaded firearms in every room. I have advised the daughters to secure these weapons, as the colonel's hands shake considerably, and he may pose a danger to himself or others. A particularly telling entry from November 1890 reads, "Called to the Blackwood house at midnight. The colonel had fired his revolver through the bedroom window, claiming to have seen intruders in the garden. No evidence of any such presence. The daughters appeared remarkably calm throughout the incident. The eldest, Miss Margaret, explained that such episodes were becoming common and inquired about stronger sedatives than I had previously prescribed. Most curious was the youngest daughter's reaction. She observed the proceedings with what I can only describe as clinical interest, as though studying the progression of her father's deterioration. When Colonel Blackwood died in February 1891, his funeral was sparsely attended. The obituary in the Jefferson County Advocate was brief, noting only his military. In 1877, the patient developed ritualistic behaviors surrounding food. She would only eat after elaborate preparation and close inspection of every item. She frequently accused hospital staff of collusion with unnamed enemies. Sedation was occasionally required during episodes of extreme agitation. By March of 1879, no significant improvement had been recorded. The patient spoke rarely, even to attending physicians, and she continued to insist that she had been committed in order to prevent her from protecting her daughters from harm. Her requests to see her children became less frequent. Elizabeth remained institutionalized until her death in 1883. Hospital records describe her as withdrawn and uncommunicative throughout her stay. Nurses, however, noted that she brightened somewhat during the rare visits from her daughters. The colonel visited only twice in 7 years, claiming that the demands of managing the family's properties prevented him from making the journey more often. The death certificate listed the cause of death as general failure of health systems consequent to self-starvation, suggesting that Elizabeth's paranoia about food had ultimately contributed to her death. She was buried in the Blackwood family plot in Harpers Ferry. Funeral records describe the service as sparsely attended, another indication of the family's growing social isolation. The 3 daughters, Margaret, Eleanor, and Ruth, were left largely to their own devices during these difficult years. School records from Jefferson Academy show that all 3 were exceptional students. Margaret was particularly gifted in mathematics and accounting. Her term papers, preserved in the Academy's archives, reveal an unusual focus on financial management and investment strategies, topics rarely pursued by young women of that period. Eleanor displayed talent in domestic arts, as shown by her prize-winning embroidery exhibited at the Jefferson County Fair in 1872. The local newspaper described her work as demonstrating exceptional precision and attention to detail, with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible to the naked eye. Her teachers noted her perfectionist tendencies. One evaluation remarked that Miss Eleanor will unpick and restart her work multiple times until achieving the exact result she desires, showing unusual patience for one so young. Ruth's aptitude for chemistry was noted by several instructors. An essay she wrote at the age of 13, preserved in the Academy's archives, demonstrates an unusual interest in preparation and preservation of food, particularly meats. Titled On Modern Methods of Food Preservation and Their Chemical Foundations, the essay displayed knowledge well beyond what would normally be expected of a student her age. Her science instructor added a note: unusually detailed understanding of organic decomposition for a student of her age, a somewhat concerning focus on methods of preserving animal tissue. All 3 girls withdrew from formal education following their mother's hospitalization. Margaret left at 18, Eleanor at 14, and Ruth at just 9 years old. Colonel Blackwood apparently decided that home education was preferable given the family's continued social isolation. He hired a series of tutors, though town records indicate that none remained longer than a few months. One tutor, Miss Caroline Spencer, wrote to a friend in Baltimore in 1879. The Blackwood girls are intelligent beyond their years, but there is something disquieting about the household. The youngest especially asks questions that no child should contemplate. The colonel is often absent, and the house maintains a silence that presses upon one's spirits. I shall not renew my contract when the term ends. Another tutor, James Harrison, lasted only 6 weeks before leaving without collecting his wages. In a letter to the headmaster of his former school, he explained, "The situation at the Blackwood house is not as represented. The girls, while intellectually capable, display disturbing tendencies. The eldest manages the household accounts with suspicious precision for one her age. The middle child spends hours arranging and rearranging items in the house to achieve some standard of order only she can discern. And the youngest, I cannot adequately describe my discomfort with her preoccupations. She dissects small animals found on the property, claiming scientific interest, but the enthusiasm she displays is most unseemly. The colonel, when present, is either indifferent or inebriated. I could not, in good conscience, remain. For the next 15 years, the Blackwood sisters lived in growing isolation. Neighbors reported seeing them only at church or during necessary trips to town for supplies. The family's once wide social circle had contracted to include only a few loyal friends and distant relatives who occasionally visited from out of town. By the late 1880s, Colonel Blackwood's health began to decline. Dr. Lambert's journal mentions treating him for respiratory complaints, as well as episodes of confusion and agitation, particularly at night. In his notes from 1890, Lambert expressed concern about the colonel's mental state. Patient expresses belief that former Confederate soldiers are plotting to burn his house, has taken to keeping loaded firearms in every room. I have advised the daughters to secure these weapons, as the colonel's hands shake considerably and he may pose a danger to himself or others. One particularly telling entry from November of 1890 reads, "Called to the Blackwood house at midnight. The colonel had fired his revolver through the bedroom window, claiming he saw intruders in the garden. No evidence of any such presence was found. The daughters appeared remarkably calm throughout the incident. The eldest, Miss Margaret, explained that such episodes were becoming common and inquired about stronger sedatives than I had previously prescribed. Most curious was the youngest daughter's reaction. She observed the proceedings with what I can only describe as clinical interest, as though studying progression of her father's deterioration. When Colonel Blackwood died in February 1891, the funeral was sparsely attended. The obituary in the Jefferson County Advocate was brief, noting his military service but little else. No cause of death was given, though Dr. Lambert's private records indicated heart failure, possibly hastened by years of melancholia and excessive consumption of spirits. The grandfather's observations were later shared with Professor Whitaker. He recalled that the Blackwood sisters purchased more preserving salt than any other family he had ever known, even those who were preparing meat for the entire winter. What was unusual is that the sisters bought it year-round, not just during butchering season. When he asked Miss Margaret about this, she smiled and explained that they had special preservation needs for their kitchen. The hardware store, owned by the Jenkins family, provided another clue. Their sales records show that the sisters purchased unusual quantities of locks, chains, and heavy-duty restraints, the sort typically used for securing livestock. When questioned, they claimed the items were needed for locking the basement storage room, where they kept valuable supplies and family heirlooms. The first documented disappearance linked to the Blackwood house occurred in February 1893, about 9 months after the boarding house first opened. Howard Phillips, a timber merchant from Baltimore, arrived on February 14th for what was supposed to be a 3-night stay while he negotiated purchasing rights to valuable forest land in the nearby Blue Ridge. According to the guest register, he checked out on February 17th, having paid his bill in full. But when Phillips failed to return to Baltimore, his family reported him missing. On February 20th, they sent a telegram to Sheriff Harlow asking for information about his whereabouts. Harlow's reply, preserved in Baltimore Police archives, stated simply, Mr. Phillips departed Harpers Ferry by morning train on February 17th. No further information available. What makes this case particularly disturbing is a notation found in Margaret Blackwood's private ledger, discovered by Professor Whitaker among the materials sealed in 1968. The entry for February 17th reads, Mr. P settled his account in full, personal effects of adequate quality. Ruth particularly pleased with the watch fob. Eleanor has claimed a leather satchel for conversion to household use. A more troubling entry follows on February 18th. Ruth's special preparation, most successful. Guests at dinner commented specifically on the tenderness of the roast. Eleanor's new preservation technique appears effective. No detectable odor or discoloration. We will continue with this method for future special preparations. Banking records for the Blackwood house show a deposit of $243.75 on February 18th, far more than a standard room and board fee for a 3-night stay. This pattern of unexplained financial windfalls following the disappearances of guests will continue throughout the boarding house's operation. The next case followed the same pattern. In June 1893, Edward Cartwright, a land speculator from Philadelphia, arrived on June 10th. He was recorded as departing on June 13th, but his family reported him missing a week later, after he failed to return home and missed several important business appointments. Sheriff Harlow's investigation consisted of a single visit to the Blackwood house, where he accepted his cousin's explanation that Mr. Cartwright had mentioned plans to travel to properties in the Shenandoah Valley before returning to Philadelphia. No further inquiries were made, despite the fact that Cartwright's horse and carriage remained unclaimed at the local livery stable for several weeks. Margaret's ledger entry for June 13th reads, Mr. C., account settled. Gold pocket watch of superior quality. Eleanor finds his walking stick useful for reaching high shelves. Ruth pleased with the quality of his boots, though too large for any of us. The next day, on June 14th, another entry appears. Ruth experimenting with new marinade for special preparation. Results excellent. Diners commented that the meat was more flavorful than previous offerings. Must remember, subjects who consume alcohol regularly require additional soaking time to remove bitter undertones. Over the next 3 years, similar entries appeared in Margaret's ledger. They always coincided with the disappearances of guests. The victims were almost always traveling businessmen, men carrying cash with no strong local ties. They would arrive, stay for 2 or 3 nights, and then supposedly depart early in the morning when there were no witnesses. The Blackwood Sisters' operation continued without raising suspicion, protected by their reputation as respectable spinsters and their family's long-standing, if complicated, place in the community. Their neighbor to the east, Widow Harrison, later recalled, "Those girls were so quiet, so proper. They always nodded politely when passing on the street and kept that house immaculate. You could see the windows shining from across the river. Never would have thought they had it in them. Though I must say, there was something about Ruth's eyes that never seemed right to me. Too calculating for a woman so young." Another neighbor, Franklin Myers, whose property bordered the Blackwood house to the north, told Professor Whitaker, "Sometimes at night I'd hear noises coming from their place. Not like a party or guests talking, more like furniture being moved, heavy things being dragged. And once or twice, I swear I heard a sort of mechanical sound, like a pulley or winch operating. Always late at night, long after decent folks were asleep. I mentioned it to Sheriff Harlow once, but he said the ladies probably just suffered from insomnia and were rearranging furniture." Myers added a detail he had previously kept to himself. "There was one night, must have been the summer of '95, when I was out late checking on my livestock during a thunderstorm. I saw lights in the Blackwood basement windows, which was unusual at that hour. Lightning flashed, and I caught a glimpse of something I've tried to forget ever since. It looked like the youngest sister, Ruth, working at some kind of table. She had her back to window, but I could see she was wearing something like a butcher's apron, stained dark. And on the table in front of her, there was something large. Then the lightning stopped, and I couldn't see anymore. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes. I never spoke of it until now." The Blackwood sisters maintained strict roles within their business. Margaret, the eldest, handled all financial matters and guest registration. Eleanor was responsible for. Housekeeping and linens were managed by Eleanor, while Ruth, the youngest sister, maintained strict control over the kitchen and dining room. This division of labor allowed each sister to rule her own domain with almost no interference from the others. It was an arrangement that later became important when authorities tried to determine individual responsibility. Sarah Jenkins, who briefly worked as a maid at the Blackwood House in 1894, offer a rare glimpse into their daily operations. In an interview conducted in 1955, the elderly Jenkins recalled, "Miss Margaret was always at the desk, watching who came and who went. She had a way of studying the gentlemen as they arrived, looking at their clothes, their luggage, even their hands. Some she greeted warmly, others with a cooler tone. The ones she seemed especially kind were often the ones who left early and were never seen again." Jenkins continued, "Miss Eleanor was in charge of the rooms, very strict about the linens. They had to be perfectly white. Sometimes I would find stains on sheets or towels, and she would snatch them from me immediately, saying she would take care of them herself. She never let me near the washing when certain items needed cleaning." Jenkins also described Eleanor's unusual system for tracking linens. She had a book where she recorded every single item, how many times it had been washed, when it was purchased, and when it needed to be replaced. If a sheet or tablecloth had been used for what she called special service, she marked it with a tiny red thread sewn into the hem. Those items were always washed separately, and Miss Eleanor handled them personally. But most disturbing were Jenkins's observations about Ruth Blackwood. Miss Ruth was the strangest of all. She never allowed anyone in her kitchen while she was cooking. The meals she prepared looked and smelled wonderful, but there was something odd about them, a sweetness that didn't belong or a texture that felt wrong. When guests complimented her cooking, she would watch them eat with this intense look, not pleased exactly, more like hungry. Despite the strangeness, Ruth's culinary skills were remarkable. A rare surviving letter from a guest, dated August 1894, mentions, "The meals alone are worth the price of lodging. Miss Ruth's roast was unlike anything I have ever tasted. Tender beyond imagination, with a flavor both familiar and exotic. When I asked about her method, she smiled and said only that proper preparation is everything, and patience yields rewards in the kitchen as in life. I have dined in the finest establishments in New York and Philadelphia, yet I find myself craving the dishes served at the Blackwood table." Jenkins left the Blackwood house after only 3 months. "I told Miss Margaret I had to return home to care for my sick mother," she explained. "The truth was, that place made my skin crawl, especially the basement. I was forbidden to go down there, but once I had to fetch preserves while Miss Ruth was away. The shelves were full of jars, but they did not contain what you would expect. I didn't look closely, I didn't want to, but what I glimpsed did not look like any fruit or vegetable I had ever seen. I left the next day and never went back." As 1896 approached, the pattern of disappearances accelerated. Between January and September that year, 4 men vanished after staying at the Blackwood house. Local merchants also began noticing unusual purchasing patterns, far beyond what they had seen in previous years. Ruth Blackwood's special order at Harpers Ferry Apothecary in July 1896 was especially suspicious. The partial receipt, later recovered from the apothecary's records, listed compounds with legitimate medical uses. But in certain quantities and combinations, they could produce powerful sedative effects. A handwritten note on the receipt read, "For treatment of Miss Ruth's continued nervous condition as prescribed." Yet no doctor prescription was ever found, and Dr. Lambert's medical records contain no mention of treating Ruth for any nervous disorder. The apothecary's apprentice, Samuel Cooper, later told Professor Whitaker, Miss Ruth had very specific requirements. She wanted to know exactly how much of each compound would cause deep relaxation without permanent harm. She asked about chemicals that could preserve the freshness of meat during the hot summer months. She had an unusual interest in various salts and their effects on human tissue. She always paid in cash and demanded absolute discretion. Cooper eventually revealed one more detail. Once, when I asked about the purpose of a particular compound, potassium bromide, since she had ordered it in such large amounts, she looked at me with the coldest eyes I have ever seen. Then she said, "To ensure restful sleep, of course. Some people require more assistance than others to reach the proper state of repose." The way she said it chilled me. After that, I never questioned her orders again. Despite the growing unease, the sisters' business continued to prosper, even during the regional economic downturn of the mid-1890s. Bank records show large, regular deposits in cash, far beyond what their guest occupancy could explain. They made several significant purchases, including new kitchen equipment, improved plumbing, and a specially designed icebox shipped from Philadelphia. According to the manifest, it was built to maintain temperatures suitable for the extended preservation of perishable materials. As summer turned to autumn, the sisters' activities might continue without interruption, if not for the arrival of particular guests. On September 18, 1896, the evening train from Baltimore brought a man who signed the guest register as Dr. Ephraim Samuels, a dental surgeon planning to establish a practice in nearby Martinsburg. He paid in advance for a full week's lodging, an amount that represented a significant sum in cash. He was given the blue room on the second floor, overlooking the garden at the back of the house. But the sisters could not have known the truth. This man was not Dr. Samuels. County records later revealed that the real Dr. Ephraim Samuels had died 3 months earlier in Baltimore. The man who arrived at the Blackwood house that September evening was, in fact, James Pinkerton, a private detective. Pinkerton had been hired by the family of Howard Phillips, the businessman who had disappeared in February of 1893. After months of careful investigation, his search led him to Harpers Ferry, where he discovered a disturbing pattern of disappearances linked to the Blackwood boarding house. For 3 days, he maintained his cover as Dr. Samuels. He shared meals with the sisters, carefully observing their routines. In his journal, later recovered among his belongings in Baltimore, he wrote, "The eldest speaks little during meals, but she observes constantly. The middle sister maintains pleasant conversation, though her eyes never leave one's reaction to the food. The youngest serves each dish personally, always waiting for the first bite before retreating to the kitchen. The meals are exceptional, perhaps too much so. The evening wine carries an unusual aftertaste, which I have carefully avoided by only pretending to drink." His notes grew more troubled as the days passed. On the second night, dinner was a roast that Miss Ruth described as locally sourced game, yet the texture was unlike any venison or rabbit he had ever tasted. The sisters watched closely as another guest, Mr. Carrington from Richmond, devoured 2 large portions with great enthusiasm. Pinkerton excused himself, claiming a headache, and ate very little. Later that evening, Carrington grew drowsy during dessert and was escorted to his room by Miss Eleanor. The next morning, Pinkerton was told that Carrington had departed before dawn to catch an early train. His final entry, dated September 21st, 1896, reads, "I am now certain of my suspicions. From the garden, I observed the basement windows. Unusual equipment is visible, a metal table with a drainage system. Large preservation containers line the walls, hooks in the ceiling, connected to a pulley system. I will act tonight. If I do not report to the Baltimore office by noon tomorrow, Agent Thompson must proceed with contingency plans." That evening, Pinkerton enacted his plan. After dinner, he feigned intoxication, stumbling up the stairs as though drugged. The sisters helped him to his bed. Margaret assured him that a good night's sleep would cure all ills. What followed is known only through Pinkerton's official report, filed in Baltimore and sealed until its rediscovery in 1962. According to that report, he waited until midnight. Hearing footsteps in the hall, he saw his door open. In the dim light, Margaret and Eleanor entered carrying a large canvas sheet, several lengths of rope, and a collection of knives and other implements. Fortunately, Pinkerton had not consumed the drug food or wine, having discreetly disposed of it earlier. He confronted the sisters. The details of what followed remain unknown, for those pages were deliberately removed from his report before it was sealed. What is certain is that Pinkerton left Harpers Ferry abruptly the next morning. He returned to Baltimore, filed his report, and then vanished from the historical record. One clue to what transpired survives, in a single paragraph that remained in his file. When he questioned Miss Margaret about the fate of Mr. Phillips and the others, she showed neither shame nor denial. She calmly replied that waste was a sin, and that wealthy men traveling alone were seldom missed right away. When Pinkerton suggested the authorities might take interest in her beliefs, she stated that her family's connections would prevent any serious inquiry, as had always been the case. The cold certainty in her eyes convinced him that leaving at once was the only way to survive. Even more unsettling was a note found later in the margin of his report, apparently added by Pinkerton himself. It read, "Miss Ruth appeared in the doorway during the confrontation, carrying a large cleaver. She smiled in a most disturbing way, suggesting that I might contribute to the household in ways other than financial. Elder sister ordered her back to the kitchen. I believe my survival was due only to my precaution of informing the Baltimore office of my suspicions before arriving here." The Pinkerton Agency's internal records, partially opened in 1967, contain a curious entry dated September 23, 1896. Agent Pinkerton returned from Harpers Ferry assignment, submitted written report and verbal briefing, exhibited unusual agitation, requested immediate reassignment to the Western Territories. Request granted. File sealed by order of senior management. 3 days after Pinkerton's sudden departure, the Jefferson County Advocate published a small notice. The Blackwood Sisters have closed their boarding establishment indefinitely due to pressing family matters. The house then stood empty for several months before being sold to a family from Washington, D.C. The new owners reported that the property was immaculate, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been scrubbed clean before their arrival. Edward Collins, the real estate agent who handled the sale, later recalled, "The house was spotless, unnaturally so for a building left vacant for months. There was no dust, no cobwebs. The basement had been freshly whitewashed from floor to ceiling, and the smell of lye was overpowering. The kitchen contained new equipment, with shining pots and pans that looked as though they had never been used. But most strange of all was the garden. It had been completely dug up and refilled with fresh earth. Neighbors said the sisters worked feverishly in the garden day and night before their departure. They told people they were enriching the soil before leaving." Collins later admitted one detail he had withheld for years. During renovations, the new owners uncovered something unusual. While removing wallpaper in the dining room, they found a ledger hidden inside the wall. They brought it to Collins, knowing he had once managed the sisters' affairs. The ledger contained names, dates, and amounts, but also, chillingly, weights and strange notes that appeared to evaluate quality. Among its phrases were terms such as prime, select, and standard appeared next to some names. I advised them to destroy the book, and they did. Some things are better left unexamined, especially in a house where one must continue to live. The sisters themselves seemed to vanish. No record of their departure exists in local transportation logs. No forwarding address was filed with the post office. Their substantial account of the Harpers Ferry Bank was closed, with funds transferred to an institution in Philadelphia under the name Shepherd Sisters Investment Trust. The only possible sighting came from a porter at the Baltimore train station, who reported to police in October of 1896 that he had assisted 3 ladies of mature years. They were traveling with an unusual amount of luggage, including several large trunks that required 2 men to move as they boarded a train to Philadelphia. He recalled them particularly because the youngest had a peculiar intensity in her gaze that made him uncomfortable. The middle one insisted on handling certain small cases herself, explaining that they contained fragile items. The porter's statement, taken as part of the Phillips family's private investigation, included an unsettling detail. One of the trunks was damaged during loading, and its corner broke open slightly. He noticed a peculiar odor and offered to repair it, but the eldest lady firmly declined. She positioned herself to block his view of the contents. Still, he glimpsed what appeared to be glass jars or containers inside, carefully packed in straw. The youngest sister whispered something to her that he could not hear, and then both looked at him in such a way that he felt it best to complete his duties and remove himself from their presence as quickly as possible. For nearly 50 years, the story of the Blackwood house faded from local memory. It became little more than an occasional reference in discussions of businesses that had once operated in the town. The sisters' departure coincided with a period of economic decline in Harpers Ferry, and more pressing concerns occupied the residents' attention. The house itself passed through several owners. County records show it was sold 3 times between 1897 and 1923, with each sale occurring after the owners had lived there less than 5 years. A curious pattern emerges in the reason for these sales. Each family cited a desire to seek opportunities elsewhere or to return to relatives in more populous areas. None mentioned any specific dissatisfaction with the property, yet none stayed long enough to establish deep roots in the community. Henry Goodwin, who purchased the house in 1912 and sold it again in 1916, later told his grandson, "Nothing wrong with the house itself. Solid construction, beautiful views, but it never felt right. My wife complained of bad dreams. She said she could hear sounds in the walls at night, like something moving or scratching. The children refused to play in the basement. They said it smelled wrong and made them feel sick. I'm not a superstitious man, but even I had to admit there was something off about the place. We never discussed it openly. We just decided one day it was time to move on." It was not until 1953, when Professor James Whitaker began researching commercial enterprises in post-Civil War Jefferson County, that questions about the Blackwood house resurfaced. Whitaker, a meticulous historian with particular interest in how the war had transformed local economies, stumbled upon the sisters' story almost by accident. Among the documents he discovered in the Jefferson County Courthouse basement was a series of unusual purchase orders from a chemical supply company in Baltimore. The orders, made between 1892 and 1896, listed substances with no obvious household application. Some of these were known to have sedative properties when administered in small doses. The chemical orders included quantities of chloral hydrate, a sedative that was commonly available in the period but rarely purchased in bulk by private citizens. Also listed were various preservative compounds, chemicals used in the tanning of leather, and substances that could effectively mask the natural taste of food when added in small amounts. Whitaker's curiosity led him to expand his research. He uncovered the journal of Dr. Morris Fletcher, the local physician during the period when the boarding house operated. In an entry dated October of 1896, shortly after the sisters' departure, Fletcher wrote, "Have examined the basement room at the request of the new owners. Found evidence of extensive cleaning, though traces remain. The drain in the floor shows signs of frequent use. The hooks in the ceiling are not consistent with normal food preparation. I have advised the new owners to seal the room entirely. Some matters are best left undisturbed." A subsequent entry in Fletcher's journal adds, "Mr. Collins has consulted me regarding certain stains found beneath the recently removed floorboards in the basement. I have advised him that the discoloration is likely due to mineral deposits from the proximity to the river." This explanation appeared to satisfy him, though Fletcher himself was not convinced of its accuracy. He wrote, "Some questions are better left unasked in a small community such as ours." Most revealing is an entry dated December of 1896, apparently written after Fletcher had consumed what he described as perhaps more brandy than is advisable for a man of my years. He wrote, "The more I reflect upon what I observed in the Blackwood basement, the more disturbed I become. The configuration of equipment suggests a purpose I dare not name. The drainage system, the hooks, the table with its channels and collection basin all suggest activities that civilized minds refuse to contemplate. And yet I cannot dismiss the correlation between guests who were never seen to depart and the exceptional meals for which the establishment was known. God forgive me for even entertaining such thoughts." This discovery prompted Whitaker to contact descendants of Harpers Ferry residents from the period. Through these interviews, he began to construct a timeline of disappearances that correlated with certain entries in the Blackwood House guest register. Each missing person had been recorded as having paid their bill and departed, always within 3 days of arrival, always after having taken dinner with the sisters. Whitaker's investigation took an unexpected turn when he managed to locate Martha Simmons, whose grandmother had worked as a maid for the Blackwood house. In an interview conducted in 1961, Simmons recalled conversations with her grandmother. She would not speak about it much, but sometimes, after a few glasses of blackberry wine, she said things that did not make sense to me as a child. She spoke about how she was not allowed in the basement after certain guests had checked out, about stains on linens that Miss Ella Lehner insisted on washing herself, about smelling something like a butcher's shop coming from the kitchen when she arrived early one morning, though Miss Ruth claimed she was preparing a special breakfast. Most disturbing was Simmons's recollection of something her grandmother had witnessed in the summer of 1896. Her grandmother said she came to work earlier than usual one day and saw Miss Ruth in the garden behind the house. She said Miss Ruth was burying something wrapped in cloth. When grandmother approached, Miss Ruth quickly straightened up and said she was simply planting new herbs for the kitchen. But grandmother said there was a smell and the cloth was stained dark. That week, Miss Ruth gave her an extra $1 and told her not to come so early again. Simmons also shared a story her grandmother told only once, on her deathbed in 1932. Grandmother said that once, when cleaning the dining room after a special dinner party, she found what looked like a small bone under the table. Not like chicken or beef, more like a finger joint. She said that when she showed it to Miss Ella Lehner, thinking it might be important, Miss Ella Lehner quickly took away and said it was just part of the special roast. Then Miss Ruth came in from the kitchen and whispered something to Miss Ella Lehner. They both looked at grandmother in a way that frightened her badly. Miss Ruth then told her, "Some secrets are best kept by those who wish to keep breathing." Grandmother never spoke of it again until she was dying and felt she needed to unburden her soul. Whitaker's research traced a possible connection to 3 women who established a small restaurant in Allentown, Pennsylvania, in 1897 under the name Harpers Sisters. The establishment operated for approximately 2 years before closing abruptly following the unexplained death of the patron who, according to local newspaper accounts, fell suddenly after dining alone at the establishment. The Allentown City Directory from 1897 lists the proprietors of the Shepherd table as Mary, Elizabeth, and Caroline Shepherd. While the image is not clear enough for positive identification, Whitaker noted in his research journal that the resemblance is striking, particularly in the case of the youngest, who had the same distinctive gaze described by multiple Harpers Ferry residents when speaking of Ruth Blackwood. A review of the Shepherd table, published in the Allentown Morning Call in December of 1897, provides an eerie echo of descriptions of the Blackwood house. The establishment offered cuisine of remarkable quality, particularly the roasted meats, which achieved a tenderness and flavor that larger restaurants could not match. A photograph in a local business association publication shows 3 women whose approximate ages align with what the Blackwood Sisters would have been at that time. The 3 sisters who operated the establishment maintained an atmosphere of refined dignity, though some might find the youngest sister's intense observation of diners somewhat disconcerting. Gentlemen dining alone were treated with particular attention and were often invited to sample special dishes not listed on the regular menu. The death that precipitated the restaurant's closure occurred in March of 1899. According to police reports uncovered by Whitaker, a businessman named George Harrington was found dead in his hotel room the morning after dining at the Shepherd table. The coroner's report listed the cause as acute gastric distress of unknown origin, though a note in the medical examiner's personal papers suggested that poisoning could not be ruled out. However, no known toxin presented this particular pattern of symptoms. By the time authorities sought to question the Shepherd sisters about Harrington's last meal, they had already closed their restaurant and departed Allentown. A brief notice in the newspaper mentioned only that they had relocated to pursue opportunities elsewhere. No forwarding address was provided. From Allentown, Whitaker followed a trail that led to similar establishments in multiple locations. a boarding house in Rochester, New York, from 1900 to 1902, a small hotel in Cleveland, Ohio, from 1903 to 1905, and a restaurant in Chicago from 1906 to 1908. In each location, the pattern was consistent. 3 women operating an establishment known for exceptional meals, followed by unexplained disappearances of male patrons, and then sudden closure and relocation. The Chicago connection proved particularly fruitful for Whitaker's research. City directories listed a restaurant called the Sisters Table, operating on the near north side from 1906 to 1908. The establishment was owned by 3 women who identified themselves as the Shepherd Sisters, Mary, Elizabeth, and Caroline, whose ages approximately matched those of the Blackwood Sisters, if they had assumed new identities. A review in the Chicago Tribune from December 1906 praised the restaurant's exceptional cuisine, particularly the house specialties of roasts and stews, which the youngest sister reportedly prepared according to old family recipes. The tenderness of the meat was remarkable, achieving a quality that few professional establishments could match. More telling was an interview with a former waiter at the Sisters Table, conducted by Whitaker in 1962. The man, then in his 70s, recalled, "The place was unusual, not like other restaurants where I had worked. The sisters kept to themselves. The kitchen was strictly off limits to staff, except for the one busboy they allowed to help with heavy lifting. They had a special room in the back that was always locked. Once a week, usually late Tuesday nights, deliveries would arrive, large-sized boxes that the youngest sister would inspect carefully before they were taken to that back room." The waiter continued, "There was a private dining room where special guests ate by invitation only, always men dining alone, usually well-dressed businessmen or travelers. The sisters would serve them personally, no wait staff allowed. Sometimes those gentlemen would look a bit unsteady when leaving, as though they consumed too much to drink, though I never once saw excessive alcohol being served. The youngest sister, Caroline, as they called her, would often help these men into cabs, saying they needed assistance returning to their hotels. What was strange, however, was that on more than one occasion, guests who left in such a condition came back the next day appearing confused, claiming they had no memory of leaving the restaurant at all." Chicago police records from 1908 contain a report of an investigation into the disappearance of William Carver, a cattle buyer from Kansas City. He was last seen entering the Sisters' Table for dinner on April 17, 1908. The investigation was quietly closed when the restaurant abruptly shut down and proprietors left the city before they could be questioned. A notation in the file reveals that unusual modifications to the basement were discovered during inspection of the vacated premises. The investigating officer, Detective Michael Sullivan, added a personal note to the record. Basement contained a custom drainage system and clear evidence of frequent hosing down. Large hooks mounted in ceiling beams. Floor recently covered with new concrete, but core samples taken from several areas indicate possible blood residue in deeper layers. Neighboring businesses reported unusual garbage disposal practices. The sisters never used the regular collection services, instead removing trash themselves during late-night hours. Sullivan's final comment in the file reads, "Similar pattern to Rochester and Cleveland cases. Same 3 women. Same type of establishment, same customer demographic. Targeted evidence suggests organized, methodical operation rather than crimes of opportunity. Recommend coordination with authorities in previous locations, though suspect subjects have already relocated beyond our jurisdiction." After Chicago, the trail becomes more difficult to follow. Whitaker's notes suggest possible connections to establishments in Detroit between 1909 and 1911, in Buffalo between 1912 and 1914, and finally in Pittsburgh between 1915 and 1917. In each case, the pattern remained consistent. 3 women operating a refined establishment, exceptional food, unexplained disappearances of male patrons, and then sudden closure and relocation. The Pittsburgh connection is particularly notable because it appears to represent the end of the trail. A small restaurant called the Family Table operated in the Oakland neighborhood from 1915 to 1917. City records show it was owned by three women who identified themselves as the Wilson sisters, Jane, Ann, and Martha. Yet their physical descriptions, preserved in business license applications, closely matched those of the women who had operated the sisters' table in Chicago. In June of 1917, the Pittsburgh Press reported on the sudden death of Martha Wilson, the youngest of the sisters, described as a culinary genius whose recipes had made the family table a required destination for those seeking exceptional dining experiences. The cause of death was listed as complications from influenza, though the Spanish flu pandemic had not yet reached Pittsburgh at that time. A more revealing account comes from the memoirs of Dr. Errol Jenkins, a Pittsburgh physician who attended Martha Wilson in her final illness. In a privately published volume of recollections, Jenkins wrote, "The case of Miss Wilson remains one of the most disturbing of my career. Her symptoms did not align with any recognized disease process. Progressive paralysis, cognitive deterioration, and eventually respiratory failure. Her sisters refused to allow her removal to hospital, insisting on home treatment only. Most curious was their reluctance to allow me to examine her food or medication. The elder sister suggested that Miss Wilson's condition might be the result of occupational exposure to certain chemical compounds used in their culinary business. I suspect a case of accidental self-poisoning, possibly from substances used in food preservation, though the sisters would not elaborate on their methods." Following Martha's death, the restaurant closed permanently. The two remaining sisters disappeared from public record entirely. A brief item in the Pittsburgh real estate notices indicated that all business assets had been liquidated and the proceeds donated to the Red Cross war effort, as the sisters had, according to the notice, returned to their family home in New England. Whitaker's notes speculate that Martha Wilson was, in fact, Ruth Blackwood, and that her death marked the end of sisters' activities. If the pattern holds, Ruth would have been approximately 54 years old in 1917. Relatively young, but consistent with a life of stress and possible exposure to dangerous chemicals used in their activities. What became of Margaret and Eleanor, if they were indeed the other Wilson sisters, remains unknown. Whitaker's research suggests they may have retired to a small town in Vermont or New Hampshire, using wealth accumulated over decades to live out their lives in anonymous comfort. In March of 1968, while examining records in the basement archives of the Chicago Historical Society, Professor James Whitaker himself vanished. His research materials were found neatly arranged on a table, with a half-written note that read only, "I believe I'm being..." The sentence was never completed. Chicago police conducted only a cursory investigation, concluding that Whitaker had likely suffered a medical emergency while working alone and wandered off in a confused state. His body was never found, and the case was classified as a missing person rather than a suspected homicide. This conclusion was reached despite the fact that Whitaker's hat, coat, and briefcase remained at his workspace, and weather records showed temperatures well below freezing on the day of his disappearance. A curious footnote to Whitaker's case emerged in 1969, when a clerk at the Historical Society reported finding an unusual item while reorganizing the storage area where Whitaker had last been working. Tucked between two archived ledgers was a small leather-bound notebook that did not belong to collection. Inside was a list of names and dates spanning from 1893 to 1917, with annotations regarding quality, tenderness, and flavor. The notebook disappeared from the evidence locker at the Chicago Police Department only 3 days after it was turned in. The clerk who discovered it reportedly took early retirement soon afterward and relocated to Arizona. Thereafter, federal authorities seized Whitaker's research within days of his disappearance. Most of it remains classified, with access restricted until 2023. What little has been released provides tantalizing but incomplete glimpses of a case that spans decades and possibly multiple jurisdictions. The few researchers who were granted limited access to Whitaker's files emerged with more questions than answers. One such researcher, Dr. Elizabeth Chambers of Columbia University, published a carefully worded paper in 1965. She suggested that the Blackwood case represented a repeating pattern of behavior. This pattern may have occurred in multiple locations across the eastern United States between 1870 and 1915. It always involved female proprietors of boarding establishments. It always targeted male travelers of means. And it was always characterized by an unusual attention to the culinary experience offered to victims. Chambers' paper stopped short of explicit accusations, but it strongly implied that the Blackwood Sisters, and possibly others operating with similar methods, were responsible for numerous disappearances spanning decades. Most disturbing was her suggestion that the sisters may have had associates or apprentices who continued their practices long after the original perpetrators had reached advanced age. This theory gained unexpected support in 1966. That year, a journalist investigating a series of disappearances in Minneapolis uncovered records of a small restaurant. It had operated there from 1920 to 1922. The establishment, called Aunt Martha's Kitchen, was run by two elderly women and a much younger third woman, who claimed to be their niece. The journalist's work was never published. He suffered a debilitating stroke while conducting research and died without completing his investigation. What truly happened at the Blackwood house remains speculation. The physical evidence has long since disappeared. The sisters themselves, if they lived full lives, would have died before 1950. Any legal reckoning is now impossible. What remains are fragments. Ledgers showing unusual purchases, a guest register with names that match missing persons reports filed in distant cities, a doctor's cryptic journal entry, and the unfinished research of a professor who vanished while trying to connect these disparate elements. Perhaps most disturbing is the cookbook, discovered during renovations to Blackwood House in 1972. It was found sealed within a wall cavity. The handwritten volume contained recipes in Ruth Blackwood's distinctive script. Most were conventional dishes of the period, but several pages had been torn out. On the inside cover was an inscription. The secret is in the preparation. Patience yields tenderness. What seems unpalatable can be rendered delicious with proper technique. The cookbook was seized by federal authorities. Its current whereabouts are unknown. Rumors persist that it resides in a special collection at the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. There, it is studied by profilers attempting to understand the psychology of killers who operate across extended time periods and multiple jurisdictions. A single recipe survived. It was copied by the contractor, who discovered the book before authorities arrived. Titled simply Special Roast, it contained ordinary cooking instructions but included a chilling notation. Subject must be properly prepared. Soak for a minimum of 6 hours in solution described on missing page. The quality of the final result depends entirely on the care taken during preparation and the choice of proper subjects. Those with excessive physical activity produce tough, stringy results. Those with sedentary habits and rich diets yield the most tender portions. Since Whitaker's disappearance, occasional attempts have been made to reopen the investigation into the Blackwood case. Each is met with administrative obstacles or the convenient loss of key documentation. The most recent effort, initiated by a true crime writer in 1966, ended when the author suffered a debilitating stroke before completing his research. Local historians in Harpers Ferry now refer to the Blackwood Sisters only in passing. Usually, it is in the context of businesses that operated in the town during the late 19th century. Tour guides sometimes mention the boarding house as once famous for its fine dining, but they omit any reference to the disappearances or the subsequent investigations. The building itself has been renovated multiple times. The basement room described in Dr. Fletcher's journal was sealed during renovations in 1923 and remains inaccessible. Current owners report no unusual occurrences, though one former tenant noted in an interview with the Jefferson County Historical Society, "The house feels strange at night. Not haunted exactly, more like it's remembering something it doesn't want to share." Park Ranger David Morris, who conducts historical tours of Harpers Ferry, admitted in a 2002 interview that certain aspects of the town's history are deliberately omitted from official narratives. We focus on John Brown's raid, the Civil War, the natural beauty of the area. Visitors come for history and scenery, not to hear about the darker chapters. The Blackwood case is something local historians know about, but it's not something we emphasize. Some stories are better left untold. He added, somewhat reluctantly, there are still people in town whose grandparents or great-grandparents knew the Blackwood Sisters. It's not something they like to discuss. There's a sense that whatever happened in that house should stay buried in the past. The current owners of the former Blackwood house, Richard and Susan Thornton, purchased the property in 1998 without knowledge of its history. When interviewed in 2005, Susan Thornton said, "We found out about the sisters after we'd been living here for about a year. A neighbor mentioned it casually, as though we should already know. We did some research at the Historical Society, but there wasn't much information." Richard Thornton added, "We've never experienced anything unusual in the house. Well, except for the garden. Nothing grows in certain spots, no matter what we plant or how we treat the soil. And there's a corner of the basement that always feels colder than the rest of the house, even in summer. But that's probably just poor insulation in an old building." A curious postscript to the Blackwood story emerged in 2009. During renovation work on an old restaurant building in Pittsburgh, workers uncovered a sealed wall cavity containing several glass-preserving jars. The contents, badly deteriorated after nearly a century, were unidentifiable and were disposed of as biological waste. However, one jar contained a small metal object. It was a pocket watch with the initials HB engraved on the case. Records indicate that the building had once housed a family table restaurant operated by the Wilson sisters in 1917. The watch was claimed by the Pittsburgh Historical Society and remains in their collection. No connection to Howard Phillips, the first documented victim of the Blackwood Sisters, has been officially established. The Historical Society's curator noted only this: certain artifacts raise more questions than they answer, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the most appropriate epitaph for the Blackwood case comes from a note found among Professor Whitaker's effects after his disappearance. Written on the back of a train ticket to Chicago was a single sentence: "The most terrifying aspect of evil is not its monstrosity, but its mundanity, how easily it disguises itself as service, as comfort, as a well-set table with a hot meal waiting." In Harpers Ferry today, visitors walk past the former Blackwood house without a second glance. The rivers continue their eternal confluence. The mountains stand silent, witnesses to secrets long buried. And somewhere, perhaps, the recipe book of Ruth Blackwood sits in an archive. Its missing pages may still contain instructions never meant to be followed again. For those who research such matters, one curious footnote remains. In cities across the eastern United States between 1897 and 1915, local newspapers occasionally reported on establishments, restaurants, boarding houses, small hotels. In each, the proprietors were noted for their exceptional cooking and attentive service. These establishments operated briefly, usually less than 3 years, before closing without explanation. And in each location, the pattern of disappearances continued. Traveling men, last seen enjoying a hearty meal, before vanishing from historical record entirely. The sisters who served more than supper may have disappeared from Harpers Ferry in 1896. But the hunger that drove them may have found new kitchens, new tables, and new guests for many years thereafter. As the final entry in Ruth Blackwood's kitchen ledger noted, when the pantry is empty, it is time to set a new table. And perhaps, somewhere in America, that table is being set even now,